In the last episode, I told you about my exploration of back pain. After talking to Esther Goclay, the posture guru who taught me to lengthen my spine, I became aware of hidden influences on my body. And that led me to a bigger question. What other rules had we accepted that are actually harmful? And why do we choose to follow those rules? This episode is about someone who asked that question decades before I did, and paid a price for it. My name is Vicky Shaw, and you're listening to Who Wrote the Rules, my journey exploring the hidden rules and norms we live by. In this episode, you'll meet an intentional community I first encountered over a decade ago and learn about their foundational philosophy that grew out of one founder's struggle to reconcile his values with the world around him. During my leave of absence from work, around the same time I was figuring out my back pain, I also decided to make a visit to some old friends in Palo Alto, California.
No, the teachers would come. Yeah.
They form an intentional community called Magic. Given their proximity to Stanford University, the residents are often academics, researchers, and students, but in the times that I've stayed with them, there were also jazz musicians, Buddhist yoga instructors, international work exchange volunteers, and, of course, tech workers like me. The physical space Magic occupies used to be 3 separate single-family homes, but in the early 2000s, they took down the dividing fences, which opened up the yards to host functional outdoor areas like a shared bike shed and tool garage. If we went on the tour of the place, everywhere we'd find fruit trees, garden plots, and birdsong.
This is a Fuji apple, an apricot, and I think another pulot. And then this is a tiny hedge that will produce pineapple guavas. If we turn around here, you'll see a mature pineapple guava hedge.
That's Hillary, one of the longtime stewards of Magic. She's showing me some less obvious details of the place. While we walk through some of the buildings, she tells me how they've had large makeovers, and they do look brand new.
This whole house is kind of a song towards salvage material. The walkway is made out of salvage bricks. The roof is made out of shingles that were odds and ends of different colors. The windows were seconds from a window sales.
Yeah.
And the flooring in the house was a nice oak flooring. So, we like to call this the trash house.
I mean, it's beautiful. Glancing inside the common rooms, you might wonder how the place is so clean you couldn't find dust if you swiped your finger across the doorframe. You might notice that you don't need to turn on the lights during the day, thanks to the installed skylights. If you stayed for dinner, you'd find a steaming mini buffet made with donated farmers market produce. These details are a product of intentional living, which means turning off autopilot and adjusting the rules you live by, your priorities, your values, and behaviors, so that they make the most sense for you and your specific community. Magic's smooth operation is a result of every resident's contributions and many decades of thoughtful organization by some core members within the community. And they also incorporated as a 501c3 organization to formalize their dedication to public service. They have programs like distributing donated food to a food bank, stewarding oak habitat with Stanford in a project called Planting for the Second 100 Years, and developing a philosophy that helps make this intentional community intentional. It's called valuescience. It's worth taking a minute to understand this concept because I myself didn't fully grasp it at first. On the surface, valuescience is what it sounds like. Science applied to value, to understand or advance it, in the same way that computer science or material science is about understanding or advancing computation or materials. But to narrow the scope of what I'm talking about, it's useful to clarify the 2 parts, science and value, and how they come together. My friend Andrew, a core resident at Magic, who was also a TA for the value science course when it was taught at Stanford, helps spell out what we mean by science in this context.
The characterization of science that they offer in the class is like what people do to make better predictions. in any circumstance, whether it be in the lab, whether it be through an observational study, or if you're just some person who is trying to anticipate the consequences of your actions and make better decisions.
So science, when we talk about it in this episode, is more about the process, making an educated guess, testing it, and reflecting on the results so you can improve your predictions next time. But the value part is more fuzzy. It encompasses so much. Value means different things to different people in different contexts. I find value in a lot of things. My friends, my morning coffee. David Schrom is one of the founders of magic and a spearhead of value science. He points out a divergence in the singular and plural meanings of the word.
If you look up value in the dictionary, you'll sometimes find that the first definition has to do with monetary worth, and that the second one has to do with moral or ethical worth. And the fact that we've evolved the English language to create this dichotomous meaning for value suggests that we've had an interest in somehow severing those two realms.
We can make a similar observation about the moral word good and commercial word goods. How does this clash of semantics within the same word, this clash between the moral and the material, affect how we perceive and navigate our world? And what do we find if we reconcile the two meanings? What does it even mean to reconcile the two meanings? David says about this split, it's all one life, it's all one movie. Why should they be separate? His way of integrating these two was by just asking, what do I want? And that seems to cover a lot between the two value and values meanings. So that's how we end up with our definition of value. Anything that we as humans want.
So it includes things like crossing the street safely, because we're not born knowing how to do that. Like, we had to learn from experience, identify patterns, and make some pretty successful predictions so that we don't get run over.
I think we can all agree we value crossing the street without getting hit by a car. At first glance, that just sounds like learning. So why invent a whole new word for that? Well, to start, like David mentioned, value can take many forms. Crossing the street safely is a very material example of value science. You want to cross the street and survive, so you gather information to get it, and you also make sure that's the direction you want to go. But after securing food, shelter, and safety, while climbing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at some point, values become less material and more abstract. And you start to care about things like belonging, social connection, or self-expression, where you're no longer learning to cross a busy street, but navigating a dinner party so you get invited back, or finding a job that better aligns with your interests, maybe even one that fulfills you. And at that level, value science might help you discover that you didn't really want to go to that dinner in the first place, or that you're in the totally wrong career path and never actually wanted to work a desk job. So maybe you course correct with some experiments. Quit your job, you risk disappointing your Asian parents, you start a podcast, purely hypothetical example, obviously. And if we expand beyond just the individual, we start to want things like freedom, justice, or equity. And at that scale, value science asks the same question it does at the crosswalk. If we keep heading this way, do we like where we're going? And if not, what does that mean for where we do want to go? So here's where value science expands upon learning. Learning helps us get what we want, achieve a goal more quickly. Value science asks if that goal is what we actually want to begin with. And often we might discover that what we thought we wanted wasn't what we actually wanted. So maybe science does have a place in helping us improve our values and live more satisfactory lives. In one of our phone conversations, David summarizes the larger pursuit of value science.
The whole idea of what is good somehow got separated from scientific inquiry, and that's something I want to learn more about, because it happened sometime between Aristotle and today. If Aristotle showed up at Stanford with his resume in hand, they'd hire him in a minute to be a distinguished professor of philosophy and ethics. And they go out to their alumni and they raise $1 gazillion to endow his chair, and they tell Harvard, neener, 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 we got Aristotle. But he also wrote a biology and a physics. And if he showed up in either of those departments with his resume in hand, they'd laugh him out of the room because he's less informed than the average 12-year-old. And so the reason for that is that the biologists and physicists have been using science to stand on each other's shoulders, and the ethicists have just been wandering in circles saying, well, we can make it up.
David is a towering and hardy man, now in his 80s, and insists on being outside as much as possible. You'll hear the birds throughout this episode. He talks in small stories like this often. After any conversation with him, I have to chew on these stories for days, and I'm usually left with many more questions than answers. David sees a gap between humanity's advancement in our physical world and in our lesser cultivated moral landscape. On one side, humanity's technological advancements can dramatically extend and enhance human life. We've got genome sequencing, $1,000 supercomputers in our pockets, and machines that keep premature infants alive and transplant organs. And yet, on the other side of that progress, this same species is also building technologies powerful enough to annihilate itself. The wealth of cities grows, but so do the numbers of people unhoused. We're more digitally connected than ever, yet loneliness and mental health crises are becoming defining features of modernity. The material world advances, but our inner world, our moral development, capacity for cooperation, clarity about what we actually value, is more important to develop now than ever. During my first time living with magic, over a decade ago, it was David who prompted me to question the motivations underlying my goals. Back then, I was absorbed in my own world. Having been born and raised in suburban Georgia, I was enamored with the lax culture of California. I was brought there by an internship at a nearby tech company, and working in the Bay Area felt like riding the HOV lane to wealth and success. I was working at Apple, flying business class and staying at nice hotels. My Chinese heritage and language skills had given me an opportunity to travel solo to China to inform on a manufacturing issue. And at first, it was a validating experience. I told myself I deserved to be there and reminded myself how hard I worked. But when it came time to work on site, inside the manufacturing facilities, I saw young people, no older than I was at the time, eating, sleeping, and breathing within a couple of unmarked buildings, one of which was windowless. They worked long hours of monotonous labor to produce tiny parts for phones, and I felt their curious eyes on me. I could almost hear them say, "Who is that? And why am I taking directions from her?" These workers looked like me, were my age. I felt like I was peering into a parallel reality. It might have been me standing there on the other side of the clean room, in the white sterile suits all the workers wore, working 14 hours a day for minimum wage, in China no less. But standing in the same room, I was instead in the red corporate coverall. Even though that was unsettling, I was relatively quick to brush off that experience. After all, I was being rewarded for my work. Doors were opening for my career, and no one else's conscience seemed to be burdened. Back in California, these trifling details were just part of the industry. But somewhere in my conscience, a question would persist, which David had once posed to me. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about. Maybe I was complaining about my internship. Maybe I was focusing too much on some detail of a project I was working on. In any case, his question stuck with me. He asked if I felt I might be rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And what I think he meant was I trying to solve surface level problems while the deeper ones went untouched? At the time, I wasn't ready to confront these tensions in my worldview. The rule I'd grown up with was to measure up to social expectation. Status, career, and material wealth meant success and evidence that I was worthy of respect. So for much of my life, those were my chief concerns. I didn't have time or space to reflect on what my pursuits were actually about. And reconciling that identity with consequences of the industry I valued was no small feat. But this is a piece of what value science asks from us. Examine our values honestly, even if the conclusion is bitter. This is how David described that experience for himself.
It began with feeling that I'd undressed and then feeling that I'd started peeling off parts of myself. If you ever had an onion that has a little rotten spot on it and you think, oh, I'll just peel off this outer layer. And I started peeling my onion. And at some point I got down to one of those teeny little onions that sometimes get served mixed with peas that are roughly the size of the peas themselves, and actually feared that there was nobody underneath all that after I stripped away all my mistakes and pretenses, that I was nothing.
Had I understood value science better and reflected more consciously on my experience in China, I might have seen that both the factory workers and I followed a trajectory, none of us the wiser, both in pursuit of what our cultures valued and circumstances allowed. Theirs the promise of an escape from poverty, and mine a treadmill towards personal wealth. My parents are Chinese. They emigrated to the U.S. with student visas to find refuge from a socially and politically unstable society. And that was in 1989, the same year as the Tiananmen massacre. Their decision to leave was a narrow opening that almost didn't happen. Had I reflected on that, I might have seen how chance had a bigger role in my success than I thought. So if where I land depends so heavily on forces outside my control, then the stories I tell myself about my success, about earning my place and deserving what I have, start to feel incomplete. If I was constantly making choices without questioning where these stories and values came from, if I was just following the current, how could I be sure I actually wanted any of it? My latest return to magic, during this leave of absence from Amazon, came after a decade spent inside lucrative industries and hitting milestones I'd once imagined as endpoints. I was disillusioned with my job at Amazon, a story that echoes the trip to China. My work on the sustainability team was feeling more and more questionable. Can my work really be justified as sustainable if it's at a company that promises instant and endless products at the expense of low-wage laborers and the environment? I was also frustrated with endless appointments to resolve my back pain that weren't getting me anywhere, so my questions continued to grow. Learnings from my back pain showed me how societal paradigms are subject to being misguided. But what about internal paradigms? Can we use value science to hold our stories up to the light and honestly ask if they align with reality and what we want? But there are real obstacles to seeing our deeply held stories. Obstacles that form the layers in the onion of our identity, so caked on you don't even see them. Things like social pressure, self-deception, attachment, the good old ego. David had faced these obstacles long before I did, and long before he had the language for them. Hearing him wrestle with the ideas he held about himself helped me understand just how hard it can be to step out of the stories we build our lives around. And that long arc of inquiry is what eventually became value science. In his story, the layers solidified in his youth.
It was a surprisingly, I'm refusing to use the word conservative, even though that's what most people might say.
David grew up in a small town in south-central Pennsylvania.
But it was really just a stuck place. People were fixed in their ideas. At one time, it was the Ku Klux Klan was headquartered there, to give you some sense of the social milieu.
Growing up, his business-oriented father had never hesitated to engage in questions from a curious young David, so he was often treated more like an equal than a kid. And by the time he entered college in the 60s, his worldview had become quite mature. But that worldview shattered when he started college at Yale.
I was called to question everything that I brought with me in terms of ideological baggage.
There, he ran into completely new questions that he'd never thought to ask before. At the time, the deadly and controversial Vietnam War was escalating. And as the U.S. aided bombing runs and ground troops, casualties rapidly rose in a country that was trying to free itself from foreign dominance. But until then, David had only been exposed to pro-war rhetoric. Answers that he thought were previously settled were now called into question. And then, listening among the protesters, he started to see.
A growing number of people in this country were questioning the wisdom and ethical underpinnings of the war. And I, coming from that background that I came from, experienced a great deal of cognitive dissonance. The people who were opposing the war were people who, in many cases, I thought were intelligent and good-hearted people, and their opposition was enough to prompt me to reconsider my own views.
This is when the onion starts to come apart and rot away. David starts to recognize the role of chance in his life, a realization similar to my own.
I was given a certain set of cultural experiences, being born to a certain family in a time and a place, and then having acted on the culture that had been transmitted to me and done so in public ways, going to church and sang the hymns and stood and kneeled and sat and prayed, and that it was chance that the person born nearest the same moment as I on the opposite side of the planet had a completely different set of ideas about who he was, what he wanted, how he was going to get it, or she. Neither one of us had ever stopped to consider, wait a minute, how do I know?
Increasingly, he became frustrated with an education that steered him towards regurgitating facts.
Nobody threw up better than I did.
David was also having trouble with his more conservative family for challenging the path laid out for him and questioning the politics and convictions his father had instilled in him from an early age. So when David first brought back these questions to his dad, expecting to have a reasoned discussion, he was instead met with rejection. For the first time, instead of being treated as a peer, he encountered dogmatism and condemnation that created tension in the family. Despite this, he still excelled in undergrad, and in his last year was one among a dozen students in his class to be excused from all of his courses and work with a faculty member to write and defend a thesis. Most students who get to that point do everything they can not to disappoint. I know I would have. But David's high discipline and studiousness started to give way to doubt. His previous worldview had rotted away, leaving him feeling ignorant, lost, and disillusioned. And with nothing to replace it yet, he reached a breaking point.
And I sat on my bed a week before the thesis was due, printed bound copies beside me, and my loaded shotgun in my lap. And I just felt, this is BS. This whole exercise is empty. This world needs something very different from what I'm being asked to do. And yet I'm being elevated to heroic proportions for having done it. And I'm out of here. And then a little voice said, you snot brat, you self-absorbed twerp. There are a whole lot of people all over the world who've given their lives in one way or another, most of them unseen to you, so that you might be who you are today, and you are not yours to throw away. If you do nothing else, pay back. Find some way, even if you're the world's kindest mailman.
David's language reflects the extent of this internal struggle eating away at him. It reveals a latent part that deeply wanted to do right by the world, but didn't yet know what that looked like. He did seriously consider becoming a really nice mailman, but in those critical moments, he also thought of a woman he was in love with at the time. The idea of being the most loving person to her that he could be also helped him step back from that precipice. He eventually graduated and even went to law school. He befriended people who helped him piece together a different life and experimented with ideas and ways of free-spirited living, loving, and valuing that were characteristic of the 70s. In those years, he saw that much of what passed for progress was eroding the very conditions that made life possible. Narrowing materialistic values were flattening ecosystems and turning more and more of the extraordinary living world into ordinary objects. He saw how backwards society's values were, profit and prestige taking the main stage, all while people and earth were exploited. It was around this time he recognized that fissure in the meanings of the singular value and plural values.
If we stop and think about it, we realize that in the realm of value, everybody wants a bargain. We all want to give as little as is required and take as much as we can. Yet in the realm of values, we all want to be as generous as we're able, giving as much as we can, and taking only what we require.
How could that discrepancy in meaning lead us so astray?
We go to work, we put in our 40 or 50 or 60 or who knows how many hours a week. We're aiming to get as much money as we can for the work we do. And then, in our spare time, we go out and we aim to be generous and give to those who have less.
He saw that the hard part in life wasn't doing what was right. The hard part was learning how to question what we assumed was right. Eventually, through many conversations and questions, he realized that most values don't emerge in a vacuum. Sure, we're born with some of what we value and want, like food and shelter and water. A large part is also acquired. We learn what to care about based on complex interactions between us and what our surroundings reward, punish, or make possible. And this is the seed of what David would later understand as an ecological approach to value. Instead of grounding values in tradition, ideology, or the status quo, or even just choosing our own values, he wanted to ask, what if some values could be derived from constraints of our environment and of nature? Nature doesn't negotiate. Its constraints are real. Gravity makes things fall at a certain speed. Seasons change whether you like it or not. Milk goes chunky if you leave it in the fridge too long. When ecosystems are degraded, life becomes fragile. So if human life is embedded in these same systems, which it is, then what would it mean to align our values with that reality? But even as this way of seeing clarified things, it created a new kind of difficulty. The narrative David grew up with complicated how he thought about his values. He, as we all do, lived inside cultures, institutions, expectations shaped by a certain set of values, ones that encouraged high scores, high salaries, and conventional success. But what he was observing about the world, ecological destruction, widening inequities, and other costs hidden inside what we call progress, pointed him somewhere else entirely. Two environments, two sets of incentives, and no easy way to satisfy both. They would soon collide, most painfully in one place, his relationship with his father.
We were alienated for the better part of 50 years. I'm going to say the better part of 50 years. And at the same time, the guy had an amazing amount of compassion and concern for those who were less privileged. And then he was constantly helping people. Oh, this guy's having a hard time. I'm going to help him get through to his next paycheck. This guy lost his dad. He needs to fly to Timbuktu. I'm going to pay the airfare. And one time he was commanded by his bosses to lay off 1,100 people. He came home from work, and night after night he was on the phone to his contacts everywhere until he placed every one of those people who wanted to be placed. He gave his all.
David's inquisitive and experimental life that started in college after questioning his values was a huge departure from the traditional course that his father had envisioned. And more than that, it was a threat to the story that had given his father's life meaning.
My dad was an engineer who rose to management, and his mantra was more, better for less. More product of a higher quality at less cost to the customer. And I asked him at some point whether he considered the possibility that that was a path to perdition, that turning more and more of nature into stuff was actually a way to make the human condition worse. And that was just beyond his ability to deal with. And because he'd come up the hard way, grew up in a house without plumbing and ate macaroni because there was no money for meat, and wore his shoes from two older brothers that had holes in the soles that he put cardboard in to keep from wearing holes in his socks, and had made it to be president of a division of a Fortune 500 corporation, he felt like, hey, hard work and ability are all you need.
David was heartbroken. He thought that their relationship had been built on shared values grounded in evidence and reason, only to discover that his dad was deeply attached to assumptions that were above examination.
A few years earlier, when I was 33 and did one of many attempts at reconciliation, got my hair cut and shaved my beard off and got put on a suit and went to his house in North Carolina and said, please, just all I'm asking is that you accept me as your son. And he said, I will never accept you as my son, ever. And I stood up at 33 you hear my voice breaking now, from the dinner table, and went upstairs to the guest room where I was staying and looked in the mirror in the bathroom and said, why? And of course, there was only the answer that we were a generation apart in a rapidly moving society.
David had wanted to pursue the questions he had in partnership with his father. But when that partnership couldn't stretch to include doubt, his options narrowed. He could retreat, set aside what he learned to preserve the relationship and stay within the worldview that had shaped his early life, or he could live by his evolving understanding of the world, live more authentically, and reach across the aisle in an attempt to mend the father-son bond they'd shared. These tensions plagued him over the next 50 years. Upton Sinclair once wrote, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. Confronting the ideas we hold about ourselves is deeply uncomfortable. It forces us to dismantle what we think we know and hold true." I recognize that discomfort in David's story, in both father and son, but also in myself. Beneath my own conventional success was a growing sense that I was optimizing for the wrong outcomes. I'd been following certain rules that defined progress narrowly, that ignored costs not on the balance sheet, and that pitted a good value against my values. And all around me, those rules were enforced in implicit ways. The feeling of praise I got for working at a large tech company, the normalization of buying the most trivial things on Amazon, the judgment passed when I finally left my job and couldn't easily explain what I was doing instead. All of it reinforced a narrative that this is what success looks like, this is what matters. But when I started examining my story more closely, I began to see how much of it hinged on chance. Where I was born, the opportunities I stumbled into, the people I happened to meet, the economic moment I entered. My trajectory was mostly improvisation, layered on top of luck. If the driving narrative of my success was based on a path that was largely accidental, what did that say about the values that arose from it? Value science, for me, revealed that status, prestige, and personal wealth were little more than narrative artifacts, values that made sense only inside an inherited and outdated story about who I was and how the world worked. In my story, that reckoning led me to step away from my job. In David's, well, time has a way of loosening constraints.
But when he was in his late 70s, he came to me and said, Davy, he used to call me Davy. He started that when I was a little boy, never stopped. Davy, you were right. And I just about fell down. I turned to him, my jaw was open, and I said, about what? He said, about everything. And I said, are you kidding me? You really think that? He said, yes. He said, I'm glad that you did what you did. I'm glad you are who you are.
After decades of tension and misunderstanding, David received something he had never expected to hear, that he was accepted and his questions were seen.
He saw it. He was a bright guy, and eventually, when he got enough distance on it, when he didn't need to toe the line and make a profit and manage the business and aim for the next promotion, he was able to see these things without cognitive dissonance, I think. He lived into the aughts, and he saw the society coming apart. He saw the population issue. He saw the pollution issue. He saw the resource depletion issue. He saw the concentration of wealth in the hands. When he was a CEO, he made something like 20 times what the average guy in his company made. The CEOs now make 300 times that. He didn't like that one bit.
Over 20 years later, our problems have only gotten worse and harder to ignore. Billionaires with outsized political influence, accelerating climate and ecological degradation, political and military mismanagement, existential threats from emerging technologies? The list goes on. Where have these old values gotten us? Is this the world we really want? We have an amazing capacity to shape our world, but power without reflection just amplifies whatever values our underlying narrative happens to carry, inherited, improvised, or outdated. Value science offers a method to examine, test, and update our narratives and values, to consciously adapt to our rapidly changing world, rather than be subconsciously molded by it. David could have chosen to shrug off his insights. He might have been a well-paid lawyer, an entrepreneur, or a manager like his dad. He'd probably even be a highly successful one by conventional measures, while still maintaining a loving relationship with his father. But instead, he chose to examine his life and wants through a scientific lens, to see himself and the human condition more clearly, to treat his values not as fixed truths, but as hypotheses to be tested against reality, to ask whether what he was striving for actually supported the right thing or merely conformed to the incentives around him. At Magic, that inquiry grew into a community.
Thank you for doing farmers market today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Great.
Yeah. And we were super efficient.
Together, residents steward ecological restoration projects, reduce waste, recover and distribute food, and continually revisit this question of how they want to live. The value science framework is often discussed through classes and conversations over dinner, always keeping ethics and evidence in dialogue. These practices shape the community I came to know today. And if you ask David, is that what he really wanted? I think he'll say yes. At this point in my story, I've grasped a new understanding of value and am ready to quit my job and take a sabbatical to continue peeling back layers of my rotting onion. With some insights from value science, I've begun to ask, what is it that I really want? And how do I know that's what I want? But I'm not done yet exploring value science. The idea might sound simple, but the implications can be profound. This idea sets a foundation for the rest of my journey in the series, as I not only question my inherited beliefs, but also discover new values. In the next episode, I meet with Andrew, the TA you heard from at the beginning of this episode.
And so here I am staring in the face a pretty big problem that most people have thought, this is too difficult for me to do, I'm not going to do it.
We'll learn about how he uses value science in his own life and in an academic context, and the barriers he faces.
I can't just give up on the people who are getting hurt and the people who are dying.
See you next time. You can learn more about value science and magic at valuescience.org. There, you can also find the same syllabus and readings used for their course. I tried to condense the ideas of value science into this story, but there's a lot more nuance and questions that I try to address in my Substack, where you can also support this work. Special thanks to the folks in the magic community, David Schrom, Jeff, Mamu, Andrew, as well as Holly and David for giving early feedback. The theme song is called The Free Market by Musical Scalpel. I write, edit, and produce this podcast in my own time. If you enjoyed this episode, rate, comment, and/or share it with a friend. It helps more than you know. I'm Vicky Shaw. Thanks for listening to Who Wrote the Rules.